welcome to Screentone Club, episode 31, being recorded on the 18th of August 2019 for release on the 20th of August 2019. This is your fortnightly look at manga. We'll focus on drink discussion, and joining me as always is a hopefully refreshed and holidayed co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yeah, I've been off work for a couple of weeks, so I've been untethered for such things as what day of the week is this, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I've somehow managed to figure out today is Sunday to be here to record this podcast. So I guess all is well.
Yeah, I must admit, whenever we had these weeks where we have like a weekend off, I immediately become unmoored from any kind of structure, and it's a case of, oh, I don't have a podcast to record. Well, it's not, it's not like it's an overwhelming part of my week, but it's more the fact that it's like, oh no, I have nothing to really budget my time against, and now my weekend is hell. So
yeah, it was doubly confusing because the previous episode we recorded earlier because of other stuff going on, and so like, yeah, there were days where I kind of like woke up bolt upright in bed like, oh god, I need to read manga, I need to talk about manga, like what's going on, and then realized like, oh no, everything's fine, I'm good.
See, the good thing about cultivating an absolutely horrific, terrifying backlog is that you'll always have manga to read. Don't worry, Elliot, you'll never get to the bottom of this pile. Yeah, you get the idea. So yeah, this is our random normal episode. You can support the podcast if you fancy on Patreon. Shout outs to all our patrons who are very kind, attractive and beautiful, and who have also decided to be evil and have picked the bonus episode for this month of August. And it is, well, it was going to happen at some point, but we have been picked very closely to read the first volume of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Glepnir? Glepnir? Is that how you pronounce that? I don't know.
I think so. That's how I say it. So I guess between the two of us, we have decided that is the correct pronunciation.
Yeah, because God knows I can't spell it, and I spell it differently every time I type it. But yeah, we're going to be reading that, which I've, random friend of the podcast, Chris Bottoms, tweeted about when he first came out and immediately put the fear of God in me. So now we're going to have to read it. Oh well. But we will do it for you, our patrons, and the people who, if you too want to join in the wonder of democracy, you can chuck us $3 a month. But also, if you only chuck us $1 a month, you get to hear bonus episodes like the forthcoming one on Glepnir. Last piece of Patreon business. Shout outs to Rob Jessup, as always, who has been posting lots of lovely countryside photos while he also flings a silly amount of money at us to yell at him over this podcast. Thanks once again, Rob. So, I'm going to be quite mean here and stake out a part of primetime early podcast audio space. Apologies, Andy. So although it's still a few months away, and frankly is barreling towards us at a speed greater than I'm comfortable with, on November sees the third return of the convention Hibanacon, which takes place in Milton Keynes, and I, very kindly, have been asked by the organisers to put on panels, one of which will be a live Screentone Club recording, hopefully, unless anything bad happens, but also there will be a manga panel, which I'm keeping slightly under wraps at the moment, but I'm asking if anyone out there in Listenerland fancies being on the panel for that podcast. So if you're thinking about attending Hibanacon and would like to be on a manga-focused podcast panel, which will be recorded probably in some form or fashion, please feel free to drop me a line at the usual sort of contact details, the Screentone Club, Twitter, the email address, etc. That would be greatly appreciated, and I can fill you in on all juicy details. But moving on, back to the normal show, we have returning champions. Did we actually, looking at our document, did we already cover this last episode, Andy? Or
no, we didn't. I think we talked about it. I can't remember whether you said you'd read it at that point in time, and I said I was planning to read it during my 2 weeks off, and I did read it because I'm good like that. Okay,
no, go ahead. I would like to hear, even if I did talk about it already, I'd like to hear another opinion or viewpoint on this. So please take it away with returning champion, Our Dreams at Dusk, Volume 2.
Yes, indeed. So we talked about Volume 1 of that a little while ago now. And I think we both had plenty of good things to say about it. It's a very interesting series that kind of tackles interesting issues. Volume 1 is primarily very much around the main character Kaname, kind of, dealing with his sexuality and his kind of, his interest in boys, and, what that meant for him. And Volume 2 is kind of, it's kind of quite refreshing on a couple of levels because, I mean, firstly, shifts its focus to one of the other characters who are kind of part of this sort of drop-in center. And it's kind of a junior high school student, called, Misora Shuji. And the first kind of good thing about that is it actually lets Kaname kind of spread his wings as the main character and actually care about things other than himself. Like, the first volume is very much a massive preoccupation with his own issues, quite understandably, because, they're a massive deal to him. Whereas the second volume actually lets him kind of look at other people's lives and kind of use some of his own recent experiences to kind of like, to shape himself and the way he tries to help others. And when it comes to Misora, basically it's kind of revealed that, although he is, he is a junior high school boy, he likes to dress in girls' clothing. And he's basically, this could have been a very simple kind of volume that could have just dropped in a character, said, hey, this character is transgender, let's explore these issues. But actually, like, it's very explicit about saying, like, hey, this character doesn't really know how they identify yet. Like, there's a whole kind of part of this volume that kind of talks about, like, hey, like, having a label of what you are or, like, what you identify as can be useful. But it's also very restrictive. Like, you shouldn't feel like you have to fit into this very specific category, this very specific name that somebody has for your, sexual or gender identification. And so, sorry.
Sorry, Andy, but it does an awful lot of kind of dispelling the idea of if X then Y. It's like, hey, I do this, but that doesn't give me this label, or I say this, but that doesn't immediately follow this. And on both sides of the divide of, Kaname, trying to get grips with himself and also, Shuji trying to also get to grips with himself, it makes for a very potent cocktail of both of them getting to grips with everything involved. Like, if anything, it's very powerful in how both of them are very, very fascinating characters, but also extremely imperfect, which frankly makes it far more interesting than being like, an introduction 101 to cross-dressing sort of idea. Sorry, Andy, I cut you off, but I just wanted to mention that.
But no, you're absolutely like, that was kind of what I was going to say is like one of the interesting things that it does is like, there's some really good back and forth between those two characters, which is kind of helped by Shuji being kind of a bit blunt, a bit of a loudmouth at times.
A brat.
Like, yeah, he is very much a brat in places, but like that actually kind of serves things quite well because, a lot of the other characters in this show, to varying extents, kind of like, tiptoe around things and leave people be to kind of figure out their own problems and their own solutions, whereas Shuji's kind of not interested in that. He's quite happy to like blurt out like, well, what's up with you, basically. And there are some really good kind of exchanges, especially as kind of Kaname comes out of his shell and like, I think actually feels all the more comfortable that somebody is willing to kind of like call him out and said, okay, well, you're seemingly like a gay dude, like what's up with you? And kind of like gives him an outlet where he can talk openly about that stuff. And that kind of works in both directions because it then allows him to kind of like probe kind of, what Shuji's deal is and kind of like, which clearly he hasn't figured it out for himself. And yeah, like, I mean, it's a really interesting volume as well because it seems like it's all set to kind of wrap up nicely with a bow of like, Shuji kind of gets to come out of his shell a bit, like he gets to go out to this kind of firework display, kind of like dressed in girls' clothing, which is kind of like a big deal, a big progression for him. But then it all kind of like falls apart at the end as kind of a reminder that like, hey, this stuff isn't all that simple. Like, Kaname kind of like fumbles what he's trying to do and kind of oversteps his bounds. And the whole thing kind of, there is progress made, but it's very much not the kind of like clean tied up with a bow and they all lived happily ever after kind of ending that another manga might try. Like, I feel like a lot of other series would use this as kind of a jumping off point of like, yep, that character's problems are fixed, everything is great. Whereas it's just like, no, this is just like very much a case of like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back on a very long and circuitous journey for both of these characters in various ways in terms of like coming to terms with themselves and kind of what they want out of their futures. And like, I think there's something really valuable actually from kind of seeing things end, as far as the second volume goes, in that fashion where it's just like, stuff has happened, people have kind of moved forward somewhat, but also there's still a lot left to be worked through.
Yeah, I think the most fascinating part of it, at least personally, there's like a macro and a micro level, I suppose. The macro one is that this entire arc basically slots nicely into the volume size of this volume of manga. I don't know if that was intended when it was being written chapter by chapter, but it's really wild how like this standalone volume almost exists as an artifact of this storyline in itself. Like, it makes it a real doozy, frankly. Like, reading through it, I thought, oh, this is an interesting new character and a new sort of angle on things. And, oh man, this thing's going to the races for the length of this volume. And it gets to the end and you think, well, you know, this is an ending of sorts. It's extremely messy, which, you know, you mentioned that other authors would probably find a way to try and make a clean out or tie it up with a bow. And this feels like much more accomplished and much more bloody difficult, quite frankly. It's like, oh yeah, people are messy. People are really, really messy. And this in particular is a complete nightmare for all involved, especially when, like you mentioned, that both of them are happy to find an outlet. The problem is that the other side of that outlet is also, again, another human being and who is using you as their outlet. And it becomes this ridiculous problem where they're both leaning on each other and then, you know, the outlet bites back, I suppose, is one way of putting it. It just becomes this ridiculous, not ridiculous, but it becomes this really powerful moment of, oh no, there's no perfect power balance here and this has all gone to hell. And, you know, people have gotten hurt, which, you know, is then the real powerful end. Sorry, Andy. Is then the very powerful ending of it is someone got hurt. This is what would happen. Like, this is the ending that was going to happen. Like, this isn't here for drama. This is someone actually being hurt and everyone involved and around has to deal with that. Also, there's like a backgrounded element of something else going on, which is more Kaname's sort of like future deal, I suppose. But it is the fact of like, this was a massive chapter both for, you know, Shuji and Kaname. And it's, like I say, it's a really powerful single volume. Like, it's kind of like eyebrow searing in how I was reading it, going like, damn, this series is not going to let off the accelerator, is it? I mean, I'm glad it's good. Everything I've read, I've enjoyed, but hoo boy, like, man alive.
Yeah. I mean, those two characters just have a very fragile codependency, and then that, you know, that ends up shattering quite at a very kind of at a very inconvenient moment, quite frankly, for all concerned, but also in a way that is not that surprising, because, you know, those two have kind of like teeter on the brink of, you know, they're good for each other in a lot of ways, but like there is so much more there that is liable to come crashing down around them that, yeah, when it does, it's kind of, it's really not that surprising. But, yeah, I'm kind of curious as to what the deal is going to be with the whole kind of like Kaname thing and kind of like, you know, the apple of his eye, because there's some movement there, and it's like, that's the one thing that almost feels like it's gearing up to be a sort of, you know, more idyllic kind of story, but it's like, having seen how this series handles everything else, like, I find it very hard to believe that that's suddenly going to be some kind of like, you know, oasis of like, oh, isn't this all lovely and sweet? Because that isn't what this series seems like it wants to deal with, and for the better, to be quite frank.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's like, if you drew a direct line of the events you mentioned, like, it could be bullet points on shoujo manga number 420. But in this series, like, I'm already kind of excited to see what it does with it, given that I know it handles all of it well. But yeah, there's enough still like question marks that hanging over that. Interesting to see what happens next, like for everyone involved. Maybe Tchaikovsky-san will finally do something. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it feels, if he doesn't get like a volume like this, I'm going to be real disappointed, because like, yeah, I every time he appears, I find myself fascinated. Like, I want to know what this guy's deal is. Like, can we please do a little bit of deep diving into what's up with him? Yeah,
he's the gag manga spin-off. Sorry. But yeah, Our Dreams at Dusk Volume 2. I haven't checked when Volume 3 comes out. But consider it already purchased, quite frankly.
Indeed.
Yeah. Plus, I think it's only 4 volumes, this thing. Like, that's the part that's got me excited, honestly, is the fact that there's a very definite hard end to this. And it's like, oh man, this is going to end in 2 volumes, and it's packed so much into these first 2, so goddamn, what next?
Yeah, like this is a series you could see, like, being dragged out forever and a day, but yeah, I'm kind of glad that it's going to be quite succinct, hopefully. And like I fully expect it not to end with any kind of like massive, like, you know, again, like everything was fixed, everything was great. But I'm definitely interested to see where it's gonna take things at the end of the day.
I mean, arguably, from my point of view at least, the fact that Kaname found the drop-in center, and even if he manages to bugger that up for himself somehow, like, he still found some measure of peace, and that's like a lot of development already. So I'm kind of good for how much the series has done already, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I think that's almost the crazy thing of, like, especially having had a gap between reading this first volume and the second, like, it's actually quite easy to forget kind of what place Kaname is in at the very start of this first volume, where, you know, he's basically contemplating suicide, and you kind of like look at where he's come across those two volumes, and it's like, oh, kid done good. Like, you know, he's a long way from being where he wants to be, but, like, you know, he's got things together in a pretty impressive fashion. And I think that's one of the nice things about this volume, is kind of seeing him then come out and be like, hey, like, how can I help other people rather than just kind of wallowing in my own problems all the time.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely interested to see what happens with volume 3. But yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. So yeah, I'm glad we talked about that again. I can't tell if we talked about that in the previous episode, so if I just repeated myself, whoops. But there we are. So, moving on to the main part of this show, my pick for this episode. So this was the not too sneaky, long pass into the grass of me finally getting to put something Touhou related in front of Andy and saying, well, here you go, lad. Although I'm pretty sure I dragged you to a convention panel about it once upon a time, years ago. I can't remember anymore.
Yes, indeed you did. I will say right off the bat, my first note on the page in front of me is ... it's Touhou Bullshit ? !
I mean, you didn't have to write the word bullshit down, but oh well. Anyway, so I picked volume 1 of Forbidden Scrollery, which is definitely Touhou Bullshit. The original writer and author is Zun, which is the namesake of the creator of the Touhou series of the vertical scrolling bullet hell shoot 'em ups, and illustrated by Moe Harakara. I meant to check beforehand if she has done anything else, or they have done anything else, and I forgot. This is published by Yen Press, and the series is actually complete at 7 volumes. You can buy it most easily from digital, Comixology, etc., Bookwalker, but it is also available physically in a standard paperback format. So, Forbidden Scrollery is set in the world of Touhou, and for the very quick sales pitch, Touhou is basically it's set in the world of Gensokyo, which is a kind of very fantastical, you know, sort of 1800s almost version of a locked away little corner of Japan, which has been untouched by the modern world. It exists alongside the modern world, and there's loads of yokai there, you know, spirits, ghosts, you know, vampires, time-stopping maids, magicians, you know, shrine maidens, gods, demons, all that sort of stuff. And the idea behind the shooting games is that something stupid happens, and then the main characters, most notably Reimu and Marissa, then fly vertically through large sheets of bullets to shoot whoever is responsible for causing a mess. And basically it has a whole heap of characters in silly hats and really, really crazy costumes who generally, in the form of the shooting game, generally just smug at each other for 10 lines and then shoot 7 shades of crap out of each other in magical battles. So Forbidden Scrollery centers it a lot more in the mundanity of the human village, and contains I've forgotten her name already. I'm really good at this, aren't I? No. Kozusu. So it centers on a book lending shop, which was a common thing post-war Japan, where, and a library of, Kozusu, who is a bookworm, who is generally a human girl, with a pair of glasses, who has the ability to basically read or interpret into some of the more magical, mystical tomes that she can lend out. And basically, unsurprisingly, these books lead to problems happening, which then, in a sideways manner, basically are then up to the general cast of the Touhou universe to resolve, mostly Reimu and Marissa. And so it has like an interesting setup, but to kind of put my resolution first, and I want to hear what Andy thinks about the setup and the whole Touhou-ness of it. But basically, my complaint with this series is it's basically a mystery series, which, much like the games, it has like a premise of, oh, bad thing happening. I wonder why. Something magical, maybe. Oh, looks like these people are responsible. Let's beat them up. Oh, it wasn't them. Oh, okay. I wonder what the real problem was. And then it goes through this stage of finding out what went wrong, or who did the bad thing and then tried to cover it up, or who's trying to take over the world again this time. Whereas in Forbidden Scrollery, it does a lot of really interesting setup and grounding of different weird, strange characters. You've got like Mamizo, the friggin' Tanuki goddess lady, who is really spooky. And a few other characters who are like big heavyweight deals in Touhou universe. But basically the problem is that it has absolutely zero way of unveiling its clues and its narrative, and especially in resolving them, which makes it an extremely frustrating read, even if you're like me, who is basically reading it as extended fan service to see all the characters, because it has all these interesting setups. Well, two in the case of this volume. The first chapter is basically just extended info dump to help people get up to speed, I think. I'll see what Andy thinks of it. But basically, I came away from this series wanting to snap my tablet over my knee, because it has these interesting ideas for incidents and events and storylines, but then utterly flubs any kind of way of unveiling and then resolving them. Like, both of them end in like a 4 text box info dump at the very end, which is excruciating, especially when it is supposed to be like a mystery series in a way. And that kind of drags everything else down, like even the character fan service, the nice art, the nice costume changes, the magical battles that you see a very small amount of, and the general mystery of the whole thing. Like, oh, why are all these teacups walking away in the dead of night? But it all just, it lands completely and utterly flat because it can't figure out how to actually tell its stories, which is awful. But that's my kind of initial sort of thoughts out of the way, and generally my sort of bottom line, quite frankly. But I'm more interested, Andy, in having now been exposed to Touhou Bullshit, could you deal with the bullshit, and was it approachable to you as someone who is not like steeped in 2 wikis worth of knowledge of this garbage?
I mean, it's interesting to kind of to hear your thoughts on kind of why it falls flat, because my assumption reading it was it fell flat for me as well, but I assumed it's because I didn't really know anything particularly about the characters or world. Like, the characters basically all get introduced with kind of like a little one-liner that's basically like their job title, effectively, which admittedly, when your job title is Maids to a Vampire, it's like, well, I know what job I'm going to apply for next time I need to, because that sounds pretty rad. But yeah, like it felt to me like I was never kind of tethered to the world or characters in a way that would let me kind of really even particularly care about what was going on. But it sounds like it's kind of a broader problem than just me not kind of knowing enough about the backstory to care. Because my assumption was that it was very much a case of like, oh, if I was kind of truly engaged with these characters and their kind of broader histories, then maybe this stuff would be way more interesting. But it sounds like that's not really necessarily the case.
Yeah, I mean, the first story basically involves like a smoke-based yokai, and like towards the near end, basically it turns into a goose chase, and it then has the main characters, Reimu and Marissa, jumping around between different like key locations and showing off in this rather packed page just all these different characters, like checking them off. It's like, oh, there's a Scarlet Devil Mansion residence. Oh, there's the like Buddhist monk characters who I can't remember the names of. Oh, there's the Residents of Hell. And it's all these characters that you notice, but it doesn't bother to try and introduce or burgeon you with, but it just makes it a tease, because then the actual like mystery doesn't really have any resolution or like development, which just makes it more annoying when it's like, you spent a quarter of a page showing the fairies that live behind Reimu's shrine, which is a nice piece of fan service, I guess, and is a nice piece of flavour, but is completely meaningless. So, whoops.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually kind of, again, one of the other notes that I wrote down here is like a resolution to the first incident is a footnote. They ran around a bunch until they fixed it, ... the end, which is kind of like how that felt. It was just like, yeah, okay, there's a thing going on here. Everybody just kind of runs around and does stuff. Like, it almost felt like a weird sort of video gamey thing, like, but not in a kind of bullet hell shooter sense of just like, here's an issue that needs to be resolved. You just need to check these boxes and then, mission completed. It felt like that without any real kind of care or craft in kind of the steps towards that resolution, or like you say, to actually the resolution itself, because it was very much just like, this is done now. This is no longer a problem.
Yeah, it's real wild as well, because especially for that first story, the actual issue that takes hold is really interesting once it gets revealed. But then the moment it gets revealed, it resolves in 3 or so pages, because it just wraps up it basically sort of explains the source of it in, as you say, a footnote. And it's like, oh, well, that's highly unsatisfying. And the way you've wrapped it up just makes it seem like almost an accident. So that sucks. Especially because especially because the main character, like Kozasu, is an interesting character who clearly has some shit going on. And, much like most of the cast of the Touhou universe, has some secret weird ability or power or just, sort of side gig. Whereas, the main characters who are doing all the running around are, unsurprisingly, Marissa and Reimu, the main two characters from the games, who do fix most of the stuff. And they're in fine form, quite frankly. Like, you get an awful lot of good fun where Marissa's threatening to steal half of anything that's not nailed down. Reimu's a cheapskate, blah, blah, blah. All that sort of charm stuff that is there, but you don't really need to know about, but it is well represented. But equally makes it weird where you have this off-kilter world where the quote-unquote main character who is driving things is there and driving events, but barely actually there or involved in the resolution, which could be a way of doing it, but just makes it very exhausting when it kind of like side cuts to her talking to herself in the bookstop going, whoops, I fucked that up, several times. So, and yeah, the second storyline with the walking China just becomes really untethered, because quite frankly, I don't know much about that character, the instigating character of that storyline, the Tanuki lady. Like, I'm not that up to date on the Touhou games anymore because I don't have much time to play them, frankly. I'm not very good at them. And so I know like the strap line of who she is, but don't know enough. So basically that storyline ended and I was like, oh, damn, I missed the character tie-in of this storyline. And also there wasn't a fucking translation note for Tsukigomo, so I couldn't remember what the fuck they were. And they just started dropping that frigging proper noun out of nowhere. And I'm like, what's that phrase again? Shit.
Yeah.
Which is annoying, especially because the rest of the translation notes are half decent, if a little short. So...
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of the thing with that particular story for me, because like I kind of find the whole like Tsuki Megami thing kind of like a fascinating little bit of Japanese culture. It's like, okay, maybe they're going to do something interesting with this, and then they didn't really do anything interesting with it, so I was kind of a bit disappointed. Yeah,
it's very exhausting. I mean, how, like, it's an interesting idea. It's like, oh, this object was loved enough to it became real, weird, but yeah, so yeah, this is a very, as I say, personally, it's a very frustrating series, even as someone who is like a fan of Touhou stuff. And, you get to see Reimu and Marissa in winter outfits, which is really nice. It's like a weird piece of fan service about like, adjusting their normal sort of like, and, you get a lot of good characters in motion. Like you get, as mentioned, the maid to a vampire, who can also stop time and has loads of knives, which is why she's a pain in the ass to fight in the game. You see lots of characters in fine form and, they're active and they're moving and they're not just like, one, mug shot on a game screen, but it's all kind of wasted because the storylines just don't really get going and then just end.
So. Yeah. I mean, that is kind of the one thing that kind of kept me going through this. And actually this is kind of true of both of the series we're talking about today. Like the character designs are really cute, but they're also really expressive. Like they're really good at kind of, conveying like the conversations, because again this series in particular, like there's a fair amount of kind of talking heads when you kind of like get down to brass tacks on it, but it kind of makes that work because the characters always kind of look animated, as it were, and there's always an expressiveness to them that kind of made it appealing just to kind of look at it. It almost made me sit and think like, man, I'd kind of like to just have like an art book of this with this artist, because it feels like they have a good grasp of these characters and kind of making them look good, like giving them various outfits and stuff. It's like there's definitely artistic skill here that, like, you know, I don't want to kind of downplay around the rest of it. It's just a shame that there wasn't kind of a story to match that, because then it would probably have been actually pretty good.
Yeah, I'm with you. I really like, you know, the art. Moe Harakawa's like artistry in this series is great because, you know, it brings, you know, things that you read, things that the main entry you know about are text files on CD-ROMs when you buy the game, or Wikipedia pages, and it brings them to life. Like, you see the shrine, you see the human village, you see Marissa farting about, you get all these characters and them in motion, and it's not just like a single, like, I've bought a number of Touhou art books in my life, and, you know, you get a single posed beautiful Photoshop picture that took 500,000 goddamn hours and way more talent than I'd ever have. But in this, you see the characters in motion, them moving, them adjusting, you know, sweeping the yard, you know, picking stuff up, eating biscuits, you know, that sort of stuff. And it all looks really nice and, you know, well laid out and well drawn, and good sense of shadow and, you know, sort of, presence, I suppose, is the way of putting it. Also, very good at drawing wood, because a lot of the buildings are made out of wood, and so it's like, damn, you drew that wooden hut well, which is kind of a weird thing to notice. Yeah,
which I guess is why there's kind of a point in this volume that feels like it's turning into some kind of fire safety PSA, because there's quite a long discussion about, like, the importance of composting and, like, why it's useful as a fire safety device, which, like, it just felt like this was going to end. It's like the end of an old episode of He-Man or something, where the characters would go turn to the screen like, kids, don't start fires in the forest, because it felt like it was going down in that direction for a little way.
Yeah,
a little way there.
Yeah, that conversation felt real Touhou to me, because it basically sums up like one of the weird smug chats that happen before characters shoot seven shades out of each other in the games, of just like weird smug non sequitur veiled threat, blah blah blah, okay, laser time, pew. So that's kind of how those discussions go in the games, except usually a bit more mean than, hey, we should compost. It's usually more just, I will use your corpse, haha. So that sort of weird thing. But yeah, as I say, I feel rather kind of let down by this. Not that it was not some attempt to try and convert Andy or any kind of nonsense, but it was a case of like, man, I hope this is good and does the characters justice, and it does the characters justice, but man, the storyline's bad. So I'm hearing it's only 7 volumes. I'm almost torn to buy volume 2 just to see if it like fixes itself and figures out how to pace a storyline. But part of my concern is that if this is coming from the writer, who would be Zun themselves, then I can't imagine it really developing further, given that this is kind of the pattern of how he writes his, you know, scenarios. So, both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. But yeah, at least for myself, an intensely frustrating work. So yeah, oh well.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely interesting because, yeah, like I kind of came away from it feeling like beyond some like good artwork, I didn't get anything out of it. So I was kind of curious as to whether you'd kind of come out and be like, no, if you're into Touhou, like this is a really big deal. This is really great. But like clearly, even with that extra layer of knowledge, it doesn't really do it.
I mean, I couldn't say what my reaction would be if I was more of a fan and just, you know, but the part of me that is a big fan just makes it more annoying, because like I say, like these are characters that are interesting and I want to see them interact in interesting ways. And I was hopeful that this would be more than just like a rogues gallery of showing off various characters for the hell of it, which it does some of, but it's a case of like, oh, they're referencing certain characters in smart ways. This is good. But there's nothing here. So it's just very annoying.
Yeah, it's like you can do that fan service, but in a way that is also kind of more broadly interesting, rather than just being like, hey, you know, look at these characters having their cameos in this manga. Like that's not interesting inherently in itself. Like it can be nice to see from a series you like, of like, oh, cool, I like that character, but you kind of want to see them doing something substantial or being involved in something substantial, and that seems to be the missing step here.
Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to just like fun tea time adventures with Touhou characters, there's an entire decade plus of comiquette like doujins I could go read, frankly. Like some of them I in fact have, of just like like I have an entire fucking doujin I can't bloody read because I can't read Japanese, which is about 2 of the characters on a train, like basically just talking to passengers. It's really sedate and lovely, and 20 pages of very nice art, including what was clearly the artist's train fancy, but they couldn't find a way to make doujin just of trains, so he shoved some anime girls in it.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of one of the crazy things for this, because I did have a moment where I almost made a note of like, this kind of feels like a doujinshi, and then I kind of like thought about it a bit more as like, I don't know, like I feel like most of the doujinshi I see have more substance than this felt like it did, and yeah, I think again that's kind of the issue at hand.
This is a bit of a weird cut, but there is one Touhou doujin which I read once on a message board years and years and years ago, like absolute yonks ago, before Touhou really kind of blew up and then shrunk back down again. But it was basically a bunch of the characters playing 2v2 Age of Empires 1 on a LAN, and it was hilarious. I loved it because it was clearly written by someone who loved both Touhou and Age of Empires, and so made tons of really good gags that were just lined up with both of those things. And, you know, I can't find it. Like, I know someone translated it and put it on the internet at some point in the past, but have I been able to find it again? No. So anyway, that's the sort of thing that you can totally do with these characters, is like make them have a LAN party.
please email or tweet the show if you know the whereabouts of that doujinshi, or if you think it was just Elliot's fever dream, which is also a possibility. Then
at this point, yes, maybe, who knows? He even had a gag where someone was trying to do an elephant rush, which was a totally viable tactic in Age of Empires 1 that you could also hard counter pig. Anyway, back to this is a very much my strike zone thing. Anyway, enough of that. So on to something else. Something also, like, frankly, from my point of view, quite daunting given the amount of praise that's been heaped on it in the past. But Andy, take it away with your pick.
Yeah, so my pick, as mentioned, is kind of, I feel like one of the most mentioned, if not the most mentioned, certainly on like my Twitter timeline, Yuri manga, Kase-San and, well, it's just Kase-San and ... basically, but the first volume is Kase-San and Morning Glories, because helpfully the author decided to give every volume and every chapter a different thing after the and, which doesn't make that confusing at all. And so, yeah, so this is a series from Hiromi Takashima, published by Seven Seas. And it's a very simple kind of Yuri tale at the end of the day. The two main characters are Yamada, who belongs to the gardening club, ostensibly, of the school. She's your typical kind of girly girl. And thanks to kind of a conversation one day with a member of the athletics club called Kase, she basically develops a crush on her. Like, Kaze's kind of like your typical kind of athletic girl. She's a little bit of a tomboy. She's super popular, kind of pretty outgoing, and she just kind of totally catches Yamada's eye. Yamada has kind of a relatively long period of kind of watching Kase from afar. Occasionally managing to have snatches of conversation, and kind of like, you know, sneaking a look at her in the changing room, etc., all the while having that classic kind of Yuri internal monologue of like, but she's a girl, like, I can't like her like that, which is kind of, it really is just kind of dropped in there almost as that trope. Like, it never kind of goes anywhere or explores that at all. It's like Yamada has her frequent like, but she's a girl thing over and over again until, spoilers, at the end of this volume, she gets asked out by Kase and she's like, yeah, sure.
Well, I must admit, I feel like the one focus of that trope is that it's not exactly being subverted, but it gets rearranged where instead of it being Yamada being all, oh no, two girls, Doushio, it becomes very clearly like, oh, I do like her, but she wouldn't like me because we're both girls. So she basically inverts it in a weird way and uses her expectations of Kase, to basically sort of like put it on her, as it were, even without voicing that. So that's kind of why the ending of the volume kind of works really well in a way, because it becomes this relief valve of, oh, thank Christ. Okay, good, cool. We can do this thing, kinda. So that, you know, I know that's kind of a weird pseudo spoiler, but come on. It's a Yuri manga.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that is fair. But yeah, so like, you know, there's a whole bunch of kind of like, you know, Yamada kind of fretting about the whole thing. It becomes increasingly clear, like as Kase kind of starts to actually get close to Yamada, that Kase is adorably awkward about this whole thing as well. And like, I think the thing that this volume does the best is the kind of like awkward teenage kind of flirting / conversations with somebody you like, where like from the out as an outsider looking in on this manga, like you can tell these two girls are totally into each other and are kind of like work really well together despite being very different personalities. But like for those characters in those moments, they're totally blind to the fact that the other individual has any kind of feelings for them whatsoever. So that's kind of enjoyable. The other thing that I really like about this first volume is it has a really good grip on kind of like ridiculous teenage jealousy when you have a crush on somebody. It's like whenever Kase goes and like hangs out with anybody else or literally does anything with anybody else, kind of Yamada gets in a bit of a mood and a bit upset about it of like, oh, but what about me? Like she's never going to pay any attention to me, and just kind of totally goes off the rails, assuming that therefore means that like Kase has no interest in her. And like I feel like that's the kind of stuff that, again, it's pretty kind of by the numbers in the grand scheme of this kind of story, but it kind of works well because it is kind of relatable and realistic to how those things tend to work. But overall, I don't know, like I enjoyed reading this for the most part, but also kind of with the caveat that it's pretty light and fluffy. Like there's not really a lot to kind of get your teeth into. I mean, again, like having talked about some of the, even in our last show, you know, where we've kind of, you know, digging deep on Blue Flag, which is, you know, far more of a drama-led romantic series. Like this is almost a nice palate cleanser to that because it's all pretty light and fluffy. There's no real drama or kind of stakes to anything that anybody's doing. And I kind of enjoyed it for that, but also, you know, it kind of felt like a snack, you know. It was very much just like, yeah, that was nice. It kind of, you know, it filled a gap in time. It hit the spot, but I don't really have anything kind of like massively kind of, I don't really have a lot to say about it or kind of any kind of massive like take homes in terms of like, oh yeah, like I feel like, you know, I gained something from reading this.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm with you in that it didn't feel like I got revealed a revelation on this series, but also I think I liked it a bit more perhaps than you did, Andy, mostly because I'm really glad that, like, towards the end there is a mention of it being quote unquote pure Yuri, which, you know, when you stack it up against things, you know, that are more interrogative, like Our Dreams at Dusk or even My Lesbian Experience of Loneliness, and you also stack it up against things like, you know, NTR, Trap and Citrus, which are Yuri, but they're kind of Yuri under a weird sheen of like grime, I suppose. But the fact that this is like so wholesome and earnest really made it kind of refreshing in its own manner. And I think the main thing I enjoyed about it is it's very much a dialogue in that, you know, you mentioned that like Kase-san, like herself, is quite shy about things or uncertain. I mean, even Yamada herself, like, has a lot of hang-ups and is very much of the like timid or retiring character who doesn't really see her own accomplishments, even though other people see hers. So she sees the best in other people, but not in herself. And you've got this really adorable, sort of really fascinating push and pull between them where they both kind of meld together. And there is this seesawing effect between the pair of them. I mean, you are mostly from Yamada's point of view and in her shoes for the series, but you do get a lot of camera pullback moments where you're kind of relieved of that and you do get to see Kase-san's side of it. And that's also interesting in its own way. And you, like I say, you get this push and pull effect where, you know, Yamada herself is the quiet, retiring one, but if you put her in a corner, she will lash out or will get upset or will, you know, go in a huff. And Kase herself is also like almost like silly, like sort of, you know, retiring in her own manner and kind of like doesn't want to be overbearing, is a bit spooked, you know. And so there is this adorable push and pull where like one of them will sort of take a step back or become comfortable and the other one will step forward trying to seek a connection. And it goes back and forth like this. Like there's a few sort of misunderstandings. Like it's much more, rather than being like, oh no, misunderstanding of the week, we better resolve this in this chapter, it's much more a case of fluid misunderstanding states of just, oh, well, you know, if we do well in this race, maybe I can ask you for something, ha ha ha. And then Yamada immediately goes to the friggin' racist on that idea. And meanwhile, it goes back and forth on that regard where expectations constantly overlapping each other. And it kind of seesawing back and forth on this before, you know, the end of the volume where they start to go out, which, you know, is only step one, and there's 4 more volumes of this, plus a sequel series which has now started up, which is actually being serialized, because from what I learned from the author's note is that this is basically a series of one-shots that kind of just followed through the same world and characters, and that's kind of why it's grown up with each chapter having its own title, which I think honestly really helps it, especially in these like starting out moments, because if it had to like fill 20 pages of content every week, it would, you know, become tiresome very quickly and just sort of run over the same ground, whereas being able to do these little time slices really, at least for myself, made it a lot more charming. I mean, there's, like you say, there's no great revolutions or sort of unveilings in this manga. It's just really wholesome and quite pleasant to watch these characters kind of orbit each other, and Yamada's like childhood friend, other character kind of kicking them in the shins every now and then, to help. So it really works in that regard. And one thing I really liked as well, was the art. You get loads of really, really good sort of super deformed or just little sort of like asides. You get lots of like cases of Yamada being a little gremlin, almost like Umaru style almost, if that works, where you get one part where she's like yelling in shock at something, and there's a tiny version of herself inside her own mouth, which is really cute and funny. And you get lots of little sort of touches as well as like, you know, quite realistic, you know, sort of, like the morning glories of the title get depicted, and also the characters themselves are quite human scale. They're not just like anime sort of like blobs. They are people with limbs and stuff, rather than just being like anime girl 1, anime girl 2, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, I do really like the character designs, and again, kind of much like Forbidden Scrollery, like it's very expressive, lots of good faces, lots of good facial expressions,
lots of good blushing, kind of, you know. Very important. Blushing is important.
Yes, there is some very good blushing, and like there's some nice little kind of moments of comedy and things as well. I mean, again, as you mentioned, the whole kind of like, oh, like if we both do well in this race, will you do something for me? Like it enjoys kind of playing with some of those tropes in a way that, you know, you kind of assume, even as a reader, you kind of go to the natural conclusion with that, and then when it actually comes around, like what the one wish was going to be on Kaze's point, it's like, oh, that's kind of adorably chaste compared to like what you were probably thinking.
But that's why the seesaw works for me in particular, is that element where, you know, suddenly Yamada is the one who is caught out being ahead of Kase-san. And it's like, whoops, hang on. So that really works for me, in that kind of push-pull between the two of them, which is what makes them kind of cute. So
Yeah. And I mean, I've not kind of read any further within the manga, but like I have seen kind of like I mean, officially they call it a film, but it's kind of more like an OVA, which is, it's done a really nice job of kind of like adapting that art style into kind of the anime space, and to, you know, giving it colour and movement, etc. And I feel like, having watched that, it does kind of tempt me to read the rest of this, just because, like, it never goes away from being quite light and fluffy, but, you know, as mentioned, by the end of this volume, they're kind of in a relationship, and actually that seemed, from what I saw in that movie, seems like it's kind of a bit more interesting, of kind of watching the dynamic between those characters as they kind of, you know, move onwards and upwards through their relationship. So I am kind of curious just to carry on with it because of that, because it feels like, you know, this is very much a starting point, and actually maybe its strongest material is actually once you've kind of got that out of the way, which again in itself is kind of nice, because I think we've all talked in the past about kind of series that, you know, where the will they won't they becomes the entire like raison d'etre of the series, and it's always nice when you have a series that kind of quickly gets to the point of like, okay, they're dating now, let's see what happens when they're actually in a relationship, which is often more interesting than the kind of back and forth of the whole will they won't they thing.
Yeah, I think especially given the structure of this series, where it is a set of one shots, allows it to like concatenate and crush down a lot of the intervening stuff to allow the author to hit the high points or the interesting bits. So, you know, extrapolating that to, you know, now them going out is interesting to me to a great degree of like, okay, if you continue doing this sort of like most interesting slice, like way of, formatting the series, I'm sure this must be good I would like to see what goes from here as both of them try and, get themselves in order, basically. Because they're both like a pair of like, Doushio dopes, really, at the end of the day. It's even, and especially the one who is like cool. The cool beauty, I suppose, is the phrase.
Yeah. But yeah, like it's a fun little series. Like I can certainly see why it is popular. Like, it's pretty easy to gravitate towards the characters, and that's often the core with this kind of thing. Like, if nothing else, I kind of find myself kind of rooting for the two characters and kind of like, hoping that they get on okay. And I think that's kind of actually quite an important thing in itself, just to actually kind of care about what happens to them and kind of wanting to see things through. So, it definitely succeeds in that sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah, they're both lovely little individuals, and you want to see them do well. So that's kind of half, as you say, half the battle. But yeah, and if you are interested to read this, the next one after this is Kase-San and Bento. So hooray, naming schemes. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more. I was kind of daunted by it, as you say, because of the amount of people out there who are really high on this series. I think it's mostly just because it's something nice to have something refreshing rather than, especially from Seven Seas, sorry to tile them with a rather thick brush, but it is the case of like, citrus, NTR trap, so it's nice to have, oh no, this is completely wholesome, wild. Who'd have thought? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, cool. Unless you want anything else to mention about it?
No, I think that's me done.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. No, I really enjoyed it. As I say, the main thing I didn't really hammer on enough, so apologies to go back to it again, but there is some really good, nice comedic flourishes and artwork. There's a lot of good gremlin form, if that makes sense. Again, Umaru. So, moving on. Next episode. So, I have pulled into my bag of tricks and I have picked out something else that I have shamefully been ignoring, even though at least 3 people have yelled at me over Discord and Twitter about it. I have picked out Volume 1 of Hina Matsuri, which got an anime adaptation semi-recently, and I completely ignored, because I haven't watched an anime in a year. Oops. But I've heard very, very good things about it. I read the first chapter a few weeks ago and was like, oh man, will you talk this on the podcast? So here we are. And Andy, how about you?
To echo that, like I've not watched the Hinamatsuri anime, but like whenever people have shown me or kind of sent me clips of it, it's always looked amazing. So I'm kind of well up for reading the source material and seeing how that goes. For my choice, I'm kind of continuing down the romantic bent somewhat, because this is actually a boys' love series. It's I Hear the Sunspot Volume 1. Which has an interesting twist based around one of the characters having a hearing disability. So I was kind of curious about it. It's available on Bookwalker and Kobo, and it's also very annoyingly on Kobo they haven't marked which volume is which, because it's a 2-volume series and they're both just listed as the title. So have fun trying to find Volume 1 of that, I guess.
God damn it. Metadata is hard, apparently, as it turns out.
Yeah.
Jeez.
So it seems, and then there is also like a follow-up series called I Hear the Sunspot Limit. So it's a true test to see whether we can actually read the right thing, if nothing else.
Limit? What kind of what is that? Limit?
Yeah, I don't know. That sounds like something you put on the end of like an Initial D spin-off, but hey,
maybe you found the crossover. It's Initial D times boys. No, let's not consider that. The art is too ugly. So, moving on to Closedown. You can find our website with all our previous podcasts, as well as a listing of the series we have covered in the podcast and notes, timestamps, etc. on the website Screentone.club. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend, tweet about it, put it on, I don't know, the book face or whatever you people use nowadays. But yeah, that stuff really helps get the word out, really helps drag more people kicking and screaming into the wonder of manga. Other notes, if you want to leave a rating on those services, also greatly appreciated. You can follow us on Twitter at Screentone Club, where we will post pictures mostly. And also, you can email us at show@screentone.club, and personal stuff. As mentioned, if you want to ask to be on a panel at Hibanacon about manga, get in touch with me. I'm Elliot Page, at Elliot Page on Twitter. Also, run the website mangasir.ch, for all your manga digital storefront needs. Andy, how about you?
Yes, you can find me telling you over and over and over again to watch the latest season of Symphogear at Hannah's 1979.
Yeah, like half my goddamn Twitter feed.
It's because they're all right.
I know, but there's like 4 series now. Ugh. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm always curious. You could almost be the experiment to see whether you can just jump cold into season 5, because there's a lot of callbacks, but I'm also not sure it matters because it's just still crazy, awesome action stuff, and you could probably just not care about who the characters are and still enjoy it. But that's just my theory.
Yeah, all I really know people have told me is sing equals robot suit, punch meteor.
Yeah,
okay.
Accurate.
Okay, cool, good. So, thank you very much for listening, and we will see you. Well, we will talk to you again. If you're a patron, you'll hear about us soon. But if not, we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. So, take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.